Hello and welcome to Insomniac Dose. You're welcome to comment your city and the time below. I always enjoy reading them. If you find these stories interesting, please consider subscribing. Let's start tonight's story. The voice had been using mine for 11 minutes. I know the exact number because I was counting. Counting was the only thing keeping me from opening the door. Daniel. A pause, breathing. My breathing. The rhythm of it, the slight catch I've had since childhood, the one my mother used to say meant I was scared even when I claimed I wasn't. Daniel, it's cold out here. I can hear you moving around in there. My hand was on the deadbolt. I want you to understand that. My hand was on it, fingers wrapped around the cold brass. I had already half-turned it before I stopped. The thing outside wasn't hurt. The thing outside wasn't Curtis, wasn't my brother, wasn't me. It had simply learned that voices open doors. 2 years of grief had made me a perfect target. I let go of the bolt and pressed my back against the wall beside the door. And when I listened to the voice, my voice, cycle through everything it knew about me. My cadence, my vowels, the way I say certain words with the consonants slightly crushed together when I'm tired. Then it said something that made the hair on my neck stand up in unison. It said, "He answered when I called." And I understood in that moment exactly how my brother had died. 11 days earlier, the farmhouse sits about half a mile off a quiet stretch of the Appalachian Trail, hidden behind a line of maple trees and a split-rail fence that no longer keeps anything out. That last detail, the fence, its obvious uselessness, was the first thing I noticed when I pulled my truck down the gravel path. The rails were weathered silver gray, posts leaning at irregular angles, gaps wide enough for a person to step through without slowing down, or decorative maybe at some point. Now just a suggestion of a boundary. Hikers pass nearby every day, thin figures with heavy packs, trekking poles ticking against stone, the occasional flash of a bright jacket through the tree line. I watched 2 of them drift past while I was still sitting in the truck, engine running, working up the energy to go inside. They didn't look toward the house. Neither of them even slowed. I'd been told the property had been in my family for 5 generations, which sounds impressive until you see the place. 2 stories, white clapboard gone the color of old teeth, a kitchen addition tacked onto the back that clearly wasn't original. A rusted hay rake leaned against the barn wall like a drunk trying to stay upright. The lawyer had described it as substantially maintained, which I now understood meant the structural damage was cosmetic rather than catastrophic. I inherited it from my uncle, who died last February. Heart attack, early morning, alone in his apartment in Knoxville. He hadn't lived here either, not for decades. Nobody in the family had, apparently not full-time, not in nearly 30 years. When the lawyer slid the deed across the table, I took it without much deliberation. I told myself it was practical. No rent, no roommates. No one asked me how I was, which was the question I was most tired of answering. The real reason was simpler and less flattering. I needed somewhere that wasn't connected to anything I'd done. Somewhere the particular geography of my shame didn't apply. 2 years ago, my younger brother Marcus disappeared while hiking a section of the AT about 40 miles south of here. He was 23. He had sent me his itinerary, expected me to meet him at the trailhead on a Saturday morning to hike out together. I was supposed to drive up Friday night, stay somewhere close, and be there by 7. Instead, I stayed at a bar until 2 in the morning. I slept until 11. By the time I drove out and walked the trail to where he'd set up camp, his tent was empty. Sleeping bag folded neatly, boots outside the tent door, like he'd stepped out to look at something. They searched for weeks. Dogs, helicopters, ground teams. They found 1 boot about 2 miles off the trail in a gully. Not both boots. 1. They never found Marcus. I've carried that Saturday with me every day since. The farmhouse felt, in some way I couldn't articulate to anyone, like a penance I hadn't earned yet but needed to pay. Coming here. Being alone here. Sitting in the silence of a place that my family owned and nobody could stand to inhabit. The inside of the house was warmer than I expected, not in temperature but in condition. Someone had kept the utilities functional. Solar panels on the south-facing roof fed a bank of batteries in the basement. The water heater was recent. The window seals were sound. There was firewood stacked in the kitchen alcove and canned goods in the pantry arranged with a care that suggested intention rather than accident. I was standing in the kitchen, still in my jacket, when I saw it. Taped to the front of the refrigerator, a laminated sheet maybe 8 inches by 11 typed in a clean sans serif font. Each header at the top, Family Safety Rules. Rule 1, do not walk toward the trail after sunset. Rule 2, if you hear someone calling your name from the woods, do not respond. Rule 3, never open the back door between midnight and 3 in the morning. Rule 4, if you see a hiker standing still near the tree line, wait for them to move before looking again. I stood there reading it twice. Then I poured myself a glass of water from the tap and sat at the kitchen table. My first thought was, clever aesthetic. The kind of rustic, spooky farmhouse charm you'd find staged on a rental listing. The second thought came slower and felt more honest. Someone in my family had typed this up, laminated it, and affixed it to the refrigerator in a house that had sat empty for 30 years. And someone thought these rules were important enough to preserve. But important in what sense? Rule 1 made obvious sense for any rural property adjacent to wilderness. Trail culture attracts odd encounters. Rule 2 felt like basic common sense about the acoustics of forests at night. Voices carried, echoed, got confused, and responding to a stranger in darkness served no one. Rule 3 was oddly specific in its time window, but not inexplicable. Back door late night. Don't encourage intrusions. Rule 4 was the one I kept returning to. Wait for them to move before looking again. There was something particular in that phrasing. Not wait for them to move on. Not wait and see what they want. Just wait for them to move. As if the stillness itself was the problem. And as if looking at something that wasn't moving might constitute an invitation of some kind. I decided it was an old mountain superstition. 5 generations of family back when the trail corridor was wilder, lonelier, and the nearest neighbor was an hour's walk. Rules accumulated in places like that. They became tradition before they became reasonable. I folded my jacket over a chair and went to make the bed. Outside, through the kitchen window, a hiker's headlamp drifted between the maples. A white star moving steadily north. I watched it until it disappeared, and I felt, for the first time in 2 years, something close to calm. The first 3 nights reinforced a version of confidence I probably should have recognized as fragile. I fell into a rhythm quickly. Mornings, coffee, a walk of the property perimeter, and an inspection of the outbuildings. The barn had been used for storage at some point in the last decade. I found tarpaulin-covered furniture, cardboard boxes with water damage that had been resealed with fresh tape, a stack of old survey maps of the AT corridor printed on heavy paper and folded with the precision of someone who used them regularly. Afternoons, reading, organizing, making small repairs. Evenings, cooking, sitting on the front porch, never the back, listening to the trail sounds carry through the trees. Rule 1 was effortless. There was nothing to walk toward at sunset. The trail held no appeal to me in the darkness. I was there to be still, not to explore. Rule 2 felt obvious in practice. The third morning, I heard a voice from the woods while I was drinking coffee on the porch. A man, somewhere in the trees, calling what sounded like a name, the forest distort sound, Syllables bounce off trunks and come back rearranged. I listened, confirmed I couldn't see anyone, and went back to my coffee. Easy. Rule 3 required mild vigilance. I set a phone alarm for 11:45 p.m. simply to ensure I was awake and conscious of the time window, not moving around half asleep and reaching for the back door out of habit. The back door led to the kitchen addition's rear entry facing the trail. It was a habit of motion risk, not a temptation. Rule 4 was the interesting one. On the second evening, I saw a figure standing at the tree line, adult-sized, carrying what appeared to be a frame pack, standing perfectly still facing the house. From the porch, I couldn't make out a face, just the silhouette against the darker mass of the trees, the shape of a pack creating a slight hump behind the shoulders. I did what the rule said. I looked away, counted to 30, looked back, gone. I registered this mildly. Hikers stopped sometimes, consulting maps, catching breath, adjusting straps. They moved on. That was all. On the third evening, it happened again. Different time of day, late afternoon, same position at the tree line. Still figure. I looked away, counted, looked back. Gone. I wrote it in a small notebook I'd started keeping. 2 incidents. Rule 4 applicable. No unusual outcome. I was cataloging, not alarmed. It felt almost like a game. The rules presented puzzles, and I was solving them without effort. It was on the 5th afternoon that I met Curtis. He came down the trail at a good pace, poles clicking, the kind of hiker who covered miles efficiently. Mid-40s, he'd weathered in the way that suggested years of outdoor life rather than recent sun. He stopped when he saw me at the fence line, and we talked for maybe 20 minutes. The casual, unguarded conversation that forms between strangers who share geography and no history. He was heading north. Section hiker, he said, doing the full trail in pieces over several years. When I mentioned the farmhouse which I'd inherited, something shifted slightly in his expression. Not fear, more like careful recalibration. Your family owns that place, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Apparently for 5 generations, I said. He nodded slowly. Heard stories about this stretch. What kind of stories? He looked at the house for a moment before answering. Trail lore mostly. Hikers go missing more often on this corridor than the statistics account for. The rescue teams have noticed it. The rangers have noticed it. He paused. The house comes up sometimes. I asked how. Nothing specific, he said. But then he added, almost as an afterthought as he was shouldering his pack to continue. If someone knocks after midnight, don't assume they're a hiker. I almost asked him to explain. Instead, I watched him go. I told myself I was curious, not frightened. I made dinner and went to sleep before 10 o'clock. The fence looked solid in the dark, and the trail was quiet, and the rules were easy. The 5th night, I was reading at the kitchen table when I heard my brother's voice. I want to be precise about this because imprecision is how I've avoided it for 2 years. And imprecision is what nearly killed me. It wasn't like my brother's voice. It wasn't a sound that reminded me of him. It triggered a memory, surfaced from my grief in the auditory cortex, and presented itself as external. It was his voice. The specific acoustic signature of Marcus, the slight Midwestern flatness he'd kept despite growing up in Virginia, the way he dropped his volume at the end of sentences rather than raising it, the quality of it, the texture of it, the thing that made it unmistakably specifically him and not anyone else in the world. Daniel. From the woods behind the house. Through the back wall, through the addition, through the dark between the kitchen window and the tree line. The chair scraped back before I consciously decided to stand. I want to be clear about the state I was in. I was not intoxicated. I was not asleep. And I was 2 years deep into a grief that had no official outlet and considerable guilt that had never been spoken to a therapist or a priest or anyone at all. I was in a farmhouse my family had used to preserve safety rules I'd already decided were mild superstition. I was alone, and Rule 2 said do not respond. I did not respond, technically. I walked to the back door and stood at it without opening it, which is already a category error in terms of the rule's spirit, but I told myself the rule said respond, and I was merely listening. Daniel, I found the trail. The exact phrasing. That exact phrasing. Marcus on the phone every time he finished a new section, I found the trail, Dan, come see it. An ongoing joke between us about the trail always being discoverable, irregardless of how many times you walked it, and a private language item that required knowledge of our specific relationship, our specific years of it. I opened the back door. Not wide, a few inches. The cold came in immediately. Temperature had dropped since sunset, and the night air off the woods was sharp with pine and something underneath it, something slightly sweet and wrong. Like the air before a thunderstorm, but denser. I stepped onto the back step. The yard was dark. The tree line was a solid black mass 30 feet away. The maples and birches blended into a single wall of shadow. Nothing moving. Daniel, over here. The voice came from the left near the old gate in the fence. I took 3 steps down from the porch into the yard. Technically, that didn't break Rule 1. Rule 1 said don't walk toward the trail. I wasn't moving toward the trail, and I was moving toward the fence. There is a difference, and I used it to permit myself. Where are you? I said. The woods went silent. Not gradually, immediately, completely, the way sound doesn't actually stop in a forest at night. No insects, no wind in the upper branches, no sound of any kind. The silence had physical weight and a quality that felt like held breath rather than absence. I stood in the yard for a full minute. Nothing. My heartbeat was very loud. I went back inside. I closed and locked the back door. I told myself that grief does this. The mind under prolonged stress and isolation produces auditory experiences that feel externally sourced. I told myself that the acoustics of the trail corridor were unusual. Curtis had implied as much, and that some quality of the terrain was projecting sounds from elsewhere, the hikers far away, whose voices traveled strangely through the valley topography. I told myself I'd answered a question in a forest at night, heard no follow-up, and that was the end of it. Nothing happened that night. Nothing happened the following morning. I began to believe that the rule, when broken, simply had no consequence. I was wrong about the timing. The footprints were there in the morning. I found them when I walked the yard perimeter. My standard morning routine, something I'd started on day 2 without consciously deciding to. Barefoot impressions in the damp soil near the back fence, starting at the tree line. Deep heel strikes, wide 4-foot, a gait that suggested unhurried purpose. The spacing between prints suggested someone taller than Marcus had been, broader-footed, but my mind did not yet assign that detail importance. And the prints advanced from the tree line to the porch. They stopped exactly where I'd stood the night before. They did not continue. I crouched over the final set of prints for a long time. The soil around them was compressed in a way that suggested significant weight was distributed over a static posture. Whatever had walked to where I'd stood had then simply stopped and remained there. For how long, the soil couldn't tell me. No prints were going back. I stood at the back door looking at the yard and then at the tree line for several minutes. Then I walked the fence perimeter. The gate had been touched, not opened, but the latch had dried mud on it that was slightly smeared, as if fingers had closed around it and then released. The trail, and this is the thing that took me several seconds to trust, looked different. Not the gravel path, the trail, the AT corridor through the woods. The line of it, the way it threaded between trees, the angle of it relative to the house. The night before, the nearest visible section of the trail had been perhaps 60 feet from the fence. This morning, when I shielded my eyes and squinted through the morning light, the trail appeared perhaps 40 feet out, no more than 45. Trees don't move, I know that. I went back inside and opened every kitchen drawer. In the third one, under a collection of loose batteries and a flashlight I hadn't put there, was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, cramped, slightly rightward slanting, the ink faded to a thin brown, and the paper had aged to a deep cream color with fold-darkened creases. Official rules are simplified, the real ones are harder, and beneath it, more writing. If it hears you answer, it learns your voice. If it reaches the porch, do not open the door, even if it sounds injured. If the trail moves closer overnight, someone in the family made a mistake. I read the last line several times. The trail had moved closer overnight. The someone in the family was me. That night it used my voice. I had spent the day searching the house methodically, moving through each room with the deliberate care of someone who needed to find every document and had to pretend the reason was organizational rather than frightened. Behind a family photograph in the upstairs hallway, 3 generations of people I mostly didn't recognize, stiff-backed in Sunday clothes, the farmhouse visible behind them. There was a second handwritten note folded into a small square, and it can only take what you give it. If you speak, it has your voice. If you answer to your name, it has your response. If you move toward it, it has your path. Inside the box of old survey maps in the barn, I found a hand-annotated document that appeared to be a photocopy of a county land record, with written marginalia in at least 3 different hands, spanning based on the ink variation. What appeared to be decades of additions. The marginalia told a partial story. The AT corridor near the property had been rerouted in 1974. The original trail had run 30 feet closer to the house along a ridgeline that cartographers had eventually determined was unstable. Hikers had disappeared along this stretch in 1962, 1967, 1971, and 1973, the last disappearance prompting the reroute. The notes didn't describe the disappearances in detail, but someone had written in the margin. They answered. They always answered. Beneath that, in different ink, rule system established 1974. Original proximity, unacceptable. Rules reduced approach to manageable distance over 2 generations. And beneath that, in the most recent-looking ink, written with a different pen, the system works as long as no one feeds it. I sat in the barn with a flashlight, holding that document until my hands stopped shaking enough to refold it. The family rule system was not an ancient superstition. It was practical management developed over the course of several generations of direct experience. Someone, multiple someones, had studied what happened when the rules were broken and what happened when they were kept, had written down the patterns, or had passed them forward in the form of simplified instructions for whoever came next. The laminated sheet on the refrigerator was a distillation, a summary. Stripped of context, stripped of explanation, stripped of the dark material that would make anyone reading it take it seriously from the start. The real rules were harder. The real rules required knowing why. That night, around 1 in the morning, the footsteps began circling the house. Slow, unhurried, barefoot on the grass. I could hear them through the floor and through the walls when they moved close to the foundation, a soft percussion, heel-toe, with no rhythm variation that would suggest human ambulation. Human walking involves micro-adjustments, stumbles, and pauses to check footing. This was mechanical in its evenness. Then the voice came. Daniel. Mine. My exact voice. The slight catch in the consonants, the mid-sentence cadence drop. the specific acoustic quality that I had only ever heard played back on recordings and recognized with the particular discomfort of hearing oneself. It had one night's sample, one sentence, "Where are you?" And whatever process it used to replicate voices had worked backward from that fragment to reconstruct something close to complete. "Daniel, let me in." The laminated rules hadn't mentioned this. The handwritten notes did. I did not move toward the door. I spent the following morning thinking in a way I hadn't done in years. Systematically, without sentimentality, treating the problem as a set of observable parameters that could be mapped and managed. And the creature, I began using that word privately because the alternatives required more qualification, operated on a specific behavioral logic that the accumulated family notes made partially legible. It approached what came toward it. It studied what it could observe. It used what it was given, voices, names, responses, movement, as fuel for a closer approach. And it maintained a relationship with the trail corridor that appeared territorial. When the trail itself was closer to the house, the creature's permissible range expanded accordingly. My broken rule had fed it a voice and a response pattern. The trail had moved closer. I was now measuring this daily from the back step with a tape measure anchored to the fence post, closing approximately 4 to 6 feet overnight each time I logged significant behavioral data against myself, and the footprints in the yard were a map of what it could reach. I wrote new rules in the notebook. Never speak outside after sunset. This required discipline. No humming, no muttering, no reflexive exclamation at stumbling on the porch steps. Never approach the woods alone. A hypothetical rule since there was no one to approach them with me, but the principle mattered. The solo trajectory toward the tree line was a language the creature read as an invitation. Never answer a voice you haven't visually confirmed. Not just voices calling names. Any voice, any appeal, any sound that might elicit a response before visual confirmation of human presence. For 3 nights, these new rules produced measurable results. The footsteps stayed near the fence line. The circling stopped. The voice calling my name from the tree line fell silent. On the 3rd morning, the trail had not moved. I wrote in my notebook, "System is responsive." Behavioral modification creates observable behavioral modification in the subject. The approach is manageable. I thought I had found equilibrium. I was still thinking about equilibrium on the 4th night when someone knocked on the back door. 3 knocks. Soft. Carefully spaced. The clock on the kitchen wall said 12:47 a.m. I sat completely still at the table. Then Curtis's voice said, "Hey, is anyone in there? I'm hurt, please." The voice had a quality that the creature's mimicry had never achieved before. A breathlessness, a specific texture of pain and exhaustion that wasn't performed but seemed to come from a real place. I heard him shift his weight on the back step. I heard, or believed I heard, the sound of someone sitting down heavily against the door. "I'm bleeding. Something happened on the trail. I just need 5 minutes, please." Rule 3 said never open the back door between midnight and 3. The creature's behavioral logic said never open the back door because it had never been able to reach the back door before. If that was Curtis, the real Curtis, a human person who had been hurt on the trail and had remembered the farmhouse and come down the gravel path in the dark, bleeding. Then he was sitting against the back door at 12:47 a.m. with whatever walked the trail between him and the woods. I could not determine which scenario was true without opening the door. And opening the door made the wrong scenario unrecoverable. I did not open the door, and I want to be honest about what that decision cost me because honesty is the point of all of this. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the wood, and I did not open the door, and for 10 minutes, Curtis's voice, or the voice wearing Curtis's voice, described pain and cold and fear with a specificity that made my chest ache. It knew details. It knew his pace, his speech pattern, the slight regional color in his vowels. It knew his name, which I had used when I told him about the farmhouse during our conversation at the fence. I had given those materials to them without understanding what I was doing. The voice cycled through several registers, desperate, then quietly rational, then angry, then resigned. It said, "I know about the rules, I know what you think I am. I'm not, I'm a person, please." At minute 9, and the voice paused. Then it changed. "You're learning," it said. The voice was no longer Curtis, it was no longer mine. It was no longer my brother's. It was something underneath all of those, a basal tone, flat and wide, carrying the same words but without the pretense of human origin. Not a disguise dropped, but a costume set aside. "You're learning," it said again, almost thoughtfully. The footsteps moved off the back step and retreated across the yard. In the morning, I found drag marks in the soil beginning near the back fence and extending back into the tree line. They were wide, suggesting something heavy being drawn backward. One set of prints overlapped with Curtis's boot print from our conversation at the front fence. Smaller tread pattern, a consistent sole wear. And then those prints simply ended in the grass 10 feet from the back door, as though the person who'd made them had been lifted. There was no blood. I had told myself to look for blood as a verification point, assuming that a legitimately injured person would have left it. There was none. The trail had moved again. Not dramatically, on 2 feet, maybe 3 almost, but in the wrong direction. Closer. It was adapting. Whatever the creature had gained from the Curtis encounter, the information of how long I could resist a human-sounding appeal, the precise behavioral signature of my sustained inaction. It was using that data to refine its approach. It had tested my new rules and found their edges. It was understood now that I wouldn't open the door to a voice I couldn't see, and that the time window of Rule 3 held even under pressure. So it would need a different kind of pressure. I found more notes that day, ones I'd missed in the initial search. Tucked inside the box spring of the upstairs bed, a folded letter in handwriting I recognized from the oldest marginalia, confirming this was the oldest document in the house's archive. It does not stop until it stops being interested. It is interesting as long as you respond, but it becomes more interesting when you stop responding, because it does not understand refusal. It has never encountered a refusal that lasted. Eventually, it will try something we haven't seen before. The letter was dated 1981. The person who wrote it had been in this farmhouse, had maintained the rules, had watched the trail, and had written, as a warning, that the creature would eventually escalate beyond the patterns the rules addressed. Eventually, it had apparently arrived. On the 10th night, the voice stopped performing. I don't know how else to describe the shift. All the previous nights, the voices had been purposeful. Marcus, then mine, then Curtis, then the cycling, each one a tool being applied. On the 10th night, it just spoke the way a person speaks when they're not trying to accomplish anything specific. Conversationally. "I remember you," it said from somewhere near the fence. The voice used was an approximation of no one particular, something assembled from several sources, slightly wrong in all of them, the way an AI-generated face can almost pass as human until you look at the teeth. I was inside with every light on, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. "You came looking for him." I wrote that down verbatim. "You were on this trail, both of you." I had not been on this trail. I had been on the section 40 miles south where Marcus disappeared. But I had hiked this corridor with Marcus 2 years before that. A day hike, nothing serious, a weekend trip where I'd driven home Sunday evening and Marcus had stayed to do another day. A fact I had not told anyone. A fact I had not thought about until that moment. He was good at finding things, the creature said, almost admiringly. Marcus had always been like that. The one who went back for the trail junction you'd missed, who spotted the marker half buried in leaves, who found things. I had said that about him at his memorial. Not here. Not anywhere near here. Yet he answered when I called. The fence rattled once, softly, experimentally, the way someone tests a latch without expecting it to give. I looked at my notebook. I looked at the rules I had written, the old rules on the laminated sheet, the handwritten addenda, and the barn documents. Generations of careful behavioral management, each generation learning a bit more, each generation writing it down, passing it forward, refining the system. And the system worked because it was predictable, because every generation of my family had behaved according to the same documented patterns. The creature had learned those patterns over decades. It knew what a person in this house would do. It had built its approach strategy around the assumption that the rules would be followed and the rules would stay within, even that the house's occupant would never deviate into truly novel behavior. That assumption was its only real vulnerability. I closed the notebook. I stood up. I put on my jacket. I walked to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the yard. The temperature dropped sharply as I moved past the porch steps. The tree line was clearly visible. The trail, measured that afternoon, was now less than 25 feet from the fence. The creature was somewhere in those trees, and when I stepped into the yard, it went silent with the complete, pressurized silence I had come to recognize as a tension. I walked to the fence. I had not approached the woods since the night I'd broken Rule 2. I stood at the fence and I was the one who spoke first. The silence lasted a long time after I spoke, not anger, not a threat, and the silence had a different quality than the held-breath silences of previous nights. Those had been taut, coiled, the pressure of something restraining itself. This silence was genuine disorientation. I cannot explain how I knew the difference, only that after 10 days of living inside the creature's behavioral range, I had developed a sensitivity to its emotional textures in the same way you develop sensitivity to weather. Not through analysis, but through accumulated exposure. It had never been addressed first. Generations of my family had built their entire management system around not feeding it, not engaging it, not offering anything it could use, which meant that every single interaction it had ever had with a person had been structured as the creature's initiation and the human's response. It had learned to speak. I learned to call, learned to mimic, learned to escalate, all in service of triggering a response from someone who was trying not to give one. And I had walked up to the fence and spoken before it spoke. I gave it my name. Not the name it had learned from the voice sample, not Daniel the way it had practiced it, but my full legal name, middle name included, the combination I never used, that no hiker would know, that wasn't on any document the creature could have absorbed from trail encounters, a name that told it something about me it hadn't been able to take. I gave it willingly. The trees at the edge of the property moved, not wind. The movement came from below the canopy level, a lateral shift in the undergrowth, like something large changing its posture. And then the trail did something I could see in the dark. The narrow corridor of lighter ground that marked it, visible through gaps in the fence boards, shifted back. 3 feet, maybe 4, away from the house, like the forest had reconsidered. I stood at the fence for a long time after. The creature did not speak again that night. The footsteps did not circle. I was cold, and my legs were shaking slightly. From the chill, I told myself, only from the chill. And when I finally went back inside, I stood at the kitchen window watching the tree line until the sky started to lighten. It did not leave entirely. I want to be honest about that because false conclusions are dangerous here, and the next person who stands in this kitchen needs to understand what happened without embellishment. The trail is still closed. Closer than the original reroute put it in 1974. And I believe the accumulated years of family rule-keeping, the decades of behavioral predictability, had allowed it to drift closer gradually, in increments so small that any single generation couldn't measure the change. The rules were damage control, not a solution. But in the mornings after that night, the trail was stable. I measured it every day for a week. No movement. The footprints in the yard stopped appearing. The back door produced no sounds after midnight. The voice did not come again. Now I understand something about what the rules actually were. My family had experienced something on this land that they couldn't name and couldn't explain and couldn't safely leave. Not because they were trapped, but because leaving meant the house sat empty. The system went unmaintained, and the trail would drift all the way to the fence line within a generation. Someone had to live in the behavioral framework. Someone had to be predictable and consistent and manageable, the way you maintain an embankment with sandbags rather than by rerouting the river. They wrote the rules down because the rules worked, and the rules worked because the creature had been conditioned by them into patterns of approach and retreat that kept it at a manageable distance. But the rules had a ceiling. They were written by people who survived by compliance, and their compliance never tested what happened when you stepped outside the system entirely. My brother had answered the voice. That's what the creature told me, and I believe it. Not because I trust the creature, but because everything I know about Marcus tells me he would have. And he would have walked toward the sound of a voice in distress. He would have responded to his own name because he was that kind of person, the kind who assumed distress was real until proven otherwise, the kind of creature the creature had been waiting for. I cannot change what happened to Marcus. I can change what the rules say. I am writing new ones now, handwritten on heavy paper, replacing the laminated sheet on the refrigerator with something longer and more honest. The new rules preserve what works. The time window on the back door, the silence after sunset, the waiting for movement protocol. But they add a layer the old rules withheld. They explain why. They include the trial measurement protocol. They include the observation that behavioral deviation, executed deliberately and from a position of information rather than panic, appears to reset the creature's approach range. And they include one instruction that no previous generation had written because no previous generation had survived to understand it. If you have lived here long enough to understand the rules, you have lived here long enough to change them. The creature is not static. It learns. You must learn faster. When the old rules stop working, speak first, not in fear, not in grief, not because you're trying to be heard. Speak first to remind it that you are not prey. Give it your real name, not the one it took from you, the one you chose. It has never met anyone who spoke first. That is your advantage. Use it before it figures out something better. I'll leave a note underneath that one, the way every previous author left marginal annotations for the next person to find. Even the creature that walks this trail took my brother because my brother was kind and trusting and believed that voices in the dark were people who needed help. The creature that walks this trail nearly took me because I was grieving and careless and believed I could follow simplified rules without understanding what they protected me from. If you are reading this, you are neither of those things. You are informed. That matters more than any rule. I'm still here. Spring is coming and the trail is full of hikers and none of them look toward the house when they pass. The fence line is holding. The backyard is quiet at night. I measure the trail distance every morning and write it in the notebook, and so far the numbers stay the same. I don't know how long the equilibrium will hold. The archived documents suggest it has shifted before, in both directions, and that the creature's patience is longer than any individual human life. Whatever arrangement I've reached with it is probably temporary in a geological sense, but in a human sense, in the sense of days and weeks and mornings where I wake up and drink coffee and hear the hikers pass on the trail and feel cautiously something approaching all right. It's holding. That has to be enough. The thing in the woods is learning me, and I am learning it, and we are maintaining a negotiated distance that neither of us fully chose and neither of us fully controls. My family built a system to keep the house livable. I'm writing the next version of that system, and I am writing it with the knowledge that the version after mine will need to go further still. Because the creature is not done learning, and neither, I think, am I.